In a forgotten town where the winds carried more dust than hope, and the skies seemed to press down heavier every day, a scrapyard stood at the edge like a graveyard of broken dreams. This wasn't a place where great things happened. This was where old machines came to die rusted warships, broken drones, twisted steel, and the leftovers of battles no one remembered. But among this rust, something else was beginning to rise, something unexpected. Arman, just 23 years old, had lived his whole life in this town. His father was once an engineer before the war took everything, including his life. Since then, Arman had spent his childhood playing among metal skeletons, learning how things broke and how they might be fixed. People used to call him strange. He didn't care. To him, machines spoke in silence, and he knew how to listen. He wasn't alone. There were others like him. Hera, whose quiet nature masked a brilliant mind that could draw entire engine systems from memory. She had lost her family during the last blackout crisis when no one came to help. Zubair, an ex-mechanic turned scavenger, always carried a half-broken drone on his shoulder like a pet. Rihan, the youngest, barely 17, was a coding genius who never learned from books, just from what he could hack into and rebuild. They didn't have proper tools. They didn't have funding. They didn't even have electricity most nights. But they had a dream. They were tired of waiting for someone to save them. The world had forgotten their town, written it off as a dead zone. But Arman didn't believe in waiting. He believed in building. One night, under the open sky, with a small fire crackling beside them, Arman looked round at the others and said, "What if we stopped fixing junk and built something new from it? Something that flies. Something that matters." Everyone laughed at first, not because it was a stupid idea, but because it sounded too big for them. Who were they? Nobodies. Scrap workers. Survivors. But when Arman didn't laugh with them and just kept staring at the stars, something shifted. Slowly, the laughter stopped. Hera was the first to speak. "We'll need something powerful, not just an engine, a reason." And that's how it began. They started with nothing. Just some old blueprints Arman had found buried in a forgotten military drive. Most of the files were corrupted, but enough data remained to give them an idea. They wouldn't copy a warship. They would build their own kind of ship, lighter, smarter, and not built to destroy, but to protect. Their plan was insane by every standard, but they didn't care. Insanity was better than hopelessness. Days turned into nights, and the scrapyard became their home. They marked out an area, made shelters from old panels, and began collecting every useful piece they could find. Engines too large for single ships, rotors broken at the base but still intact, circuit boards cracked down the middle but with salvageable sections. To others, it was junk. To them, it was the beginning. Zubair became the scavenger leader, mapping routes into restricted zones and derelict hangars. Hera began designing frame models using chalk on metal sheets. Rihan cracked into old databases to retrieve forgotten flight codes and AI protocols. Arman welded, shaped, and led with quiet determination. But nothing came easy. Their first assembly attempt failed. The thrusters ignited but sent the frame sliding across the yard, crashing into a stack of old car husks. The sound echoed through the town, followed by laughter from neighbors who already thought they were crazy. Even worse was the ridicule. "You think you can build a ship from garbage? This isn't a movie. No one's coming to help when you blow yourselves up." But every insult was like fuel. They didn't respond. They worked. They learned. Electricity was a major problem. Power cuts lasted days, so they built their own energy rigs using old solar panels and car batteries. The panels were slow and fragile, but they worked just enough to keep their tools running. When their only laptop died during a heat surge, Hira recalculated entire flight specs by hand using a ruler and pages torn from old books. There were close calls to one night. During a welding session, a pressurized fuel cell ignited and sent a fireball bursting across the yard. Armand's arm was burned, and Rihon's eyebrows were gone. It could have killed them, but instead of panic, they reacted like a team. Water, sand, coolant foam. Fire out, back to work. They never forgot that moment. It reminded them this wasn't a game. One wrong move could mean death, but it also reminded them how far they were willing to go. What kept them going wasn't just the dream of a flying machine, it was what the machine represented. A chance to fight back not with guns, but with innovation. A way to say, we are not forgotten. We are not weak. They wanted a symbol that couldn't be ignored. The ship design slowly evolved. They called it Project Olamine the Trustworthy. It was built from the skeleton of a broken cargo hauler, the wings of 2 wrecked drones, and a hybrid engine system that had never existed before. It was patched, asymmetrical, and scarred, but it was theirs. They crafted a cockpit from armored glass and reinforced it with the same alloys used in military tanks, which they melted down and reshaped. They insulated the inner hull using old space blanket materials they found in emergency kits. The flight system was stitched together from 3 different nav systems, all outdated, but stitched with custom code by Rihan to make them function like one. There were many times they thought it wouldn't work. The steering module once jammed, spinning the entire prototype in circles until Zubair manually shut it down. The heat management system failed during a test hover and nearly cooked the engine core. Still, they persisted as the ship took shape. So did their bond. These weren't just mechanics anymore, they were family. They shared food, slept under the same steel roof, and protected each other like siblings. When Hira fell ill from exhaustion, the project paused for 3 days until she recovered. When Arman ran out of welding rods, the others pooled money from odd jobs to buy more. People in the town started watching, first from a distance, then closer. Some kids came by, offering to clean tools or fetch parts. Even the ones who had laughed began to go silent, because something was happening in that yard. Something real. The turning point came when they tested the main engine. It wasn't supposed to work. The parts were too mismatched. But they'd reinforced the chamber with carbon-laced plates and fed the fuel line a mix of recovered hydrogen and a chemical compound Rihan had discovered in an old science journal. When they powered it on, the engine roared, not a violent roar, but smooth, steady, and alive. The ground shook, tools fell over, and for the first time, the people around them believed that sound it didn't belong to junk. It belonged to a machine ready to fly. That night, under the same stars that had once made them feel small, Armine looked at the others and smiled. "We're not done yet," he said, "but we're closer than anyone ever thought we'd get." And in that scrapyard, among rust and forgotten things, hope began to burn, like fire through steel. Because they didn't just want to build a ship, they wanted to make the world remember that even when you're given nothing but scrap, you can still build something that touches the sky. And they were just getting started. The early mornings in the scrapyard were quiet, but never calm. The sound of metal grinding, sparks flying, and voices calling out measurements had become a new kind of music. The sun had barely risen, and already the team was covered in grease and sweat. It wasn't just work anymore. It was survival. It was obsession. It was belief. After the successful engine test, something had shifted in the air. For the first time, the ship wasn't just an idea in their heads or pieces of junk lying on the ground. It was becoming real, and that reality came with new problems, bigger, sharper, and more dangerous than ever before. The main structure of the ship was now upright. It looked rough, uneven, and some panels were still missing, but to them it was beautiful. The ship stood like a wounded bird trying to spread its wings. They didn't care what others saw. To them, it was strength. But now came the hard part, the internal systems. Their biggest challenge was control, how to fly the ship safely, how to steer it without losing balance, and how to keep the power flow stable. Rihan was spending every night digging through old code files, trying to combine 3 different navigation systems into one working brain. It was like trying to make 3 people speak one sentence at the same time, in perfect harmony. He didn't sleep much. Hunched over a monitor with flickering lights, he sipped tea gone cold, his eyes red from staring at lines of code. Once, he passed out at the keyboard, and Zubair found him at dawn, face flat on the desk, muttering numbers in his sleep. Meanwhile, Hira was redesigning the wings. The old ones were too short for lift, but too heavy to extend. So she came up with an idea: make them retractable. Use old satellite dish parts as folding mechanisms. It had never been done before, not like this. She tested it with a small model first, and it worked. The real test came when they attached the wings to the actual ship. Everyone held their breath. With a hiss of hydraulics and the grinding of metal, the wings extended Nevin, shaky, but they moved. Hira didn't smile. She just nodded, quietly proud, and went right back to fixing the alignment. But with progress came danger. One evening, they were testing the vertical stabilizers when the power core began to overheat. The temperature rose fast, and the coolant system failed. Within seconds, smoke filled the air, and alarms screamed through the yard. "Shut it down," Armon shouted, diving under the panel. But the switch was stuck. Zubair ran for the emergency fuse while Hira grabbed an extinguisher. The heat was unbearable. Rihan used his bare hands to pull out the control relay, burning his palms. The system finally shut down, coughing out sparks and smoke it could have exploded. It could have killed them, but it didn't, and they didn't stop. Rihan's hands were bandaged for 2 weeks, but he still typed with his knuckles, determined not to fall behind. Arman reinforced the coolant lines with tubing stolen from an abandoned medical lab. They had no manuals, no safety gear, no permission, but they had each other. That was enough. News of the project was spreading through the town. At first, people had laughed. Now, they stared, some with curiosity, some with fear, and some with silent admiration. Kids came by the fence to watch. A few brave ones asked to help, offering to clean tools or hold wires. And then came the reporters. One afternoon, a group of outsiders arrived with cameras, notebooks, and too many questions. Is this a military ship? Who is funding you? Are you building weapons? Armon stood in front of the half-built ship, his clothes stained, his eyes tired but proud, and said, "We're building a future, one that doesn't ask for permission." The clip went viral, and that brought trouble. A few days later, masked men entered the yard at night, looking for blueprints. They thought the team was working for some underground militia or government rival. They didn't understand that these were just young people building from scraps. Powered by nothing but willpower, the attackers smashed parts, burned some tools, and left a message painted on a metal sheet. Stop, or we stop you. But fear didn't grow in the scrapyard. Fire did. They cleaned the damage, fixed what they could, and doubled their security. Zubair set up old drones to fly patrol at night. Rehan coded motion sensors into the yard. They weren't going to be bullied. Not now, not after everything. As weeks passed, the systems began to connect. The engine no longer sputtered. The wings opened smoothly. The control panel lit up like a constellation. They painted the body mat black, not for style, but to absorb heat and reflect radar. Every part had a reason. Every design had a purpose. The inside of the ship felt sacred. Hera lined the cockpit with insulation made from melted emergency blankets. Rehan designed a HUD using parts from broken VR goggles. Zubair crafted the pilot's seat from an old ejector frame, reinforced with shock pads. But they still had one last problem: the test flight. A ship that never leaves the ground is still just a sculpture. If it couldn't fly, everything would mean nothing. They chose a day when the winds were calm and the skies were clear. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Some came to watch. Others stayed inside, afraid of what might happen. Arman stepped into the pilot's seat. The others stood at their stations, hands trembling. The engine hummed, the wings extended, the thrusters glowed. Olamine, Arman whispered, "Don't fail me now." With a deep rumble, the ship lifted off the ground 1 meter, then 2. Dust spun wildly, and metal screamed under stress. The ship tilted slightly, then balanced. The wings adjusted automatically. The crowd gasped. It hovered, it floated. It moved only for 10 seconds. Then the left stabilizer failed, and the ship dropped back, landing with a harsh thud that shook the ground. Everyone ran toward it. Arman climbed out, limping slightly, helmet off, face covered in sweat but smiling. "It flies," he said. "Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it flew." That was all they needed. In those 10 seconds, everything changed. They weren't just dreamers anymore. They weren't scrap workers. They were builders, innovators, threats, heroes, and now the world would have to pay attention. Because what they built wasn't just a machine, it was a message. You can give people nothing but your leftovers, your trash, your broken pieces, but if they have courage and fire in their hearts, they will build something that even empires will fear. And Olamine was just the beginning. The scrapyard was no longer silent. The sound of belief echoed there now in the humming of machines, in the rustling footsteps of children who came every evening to watch, in the deep breaths the team took each time they turned on the ship's core systems. The world didn't understand it yet, but something powerful was growing in this forgotten town, built from metal nobody wanted, by people nobody noticed. The ship, Olamine, had lifted off the ground. Even if only for a few seconds, even if it had crashed back down, that short moment had changed everything. It had shown what was possible. It had opened a door that could not be closed again. Arman's leg was still sore from the rough landing, but he walked with a fire in his step. Hera was already back at the whiteboard, fixing the problem that caused the left stabilizer to fail. Rehan was rewriting flight code, adding new parameters to adjust the ship's balance during vertical takeoff. Zubair and 2 new volunteers worked on reinforcing the landing gear with steel strips. melted from tank armor. Every hour mattered now. Something told them they didn't have much time before the world truly noticed what they were doing. And the world was noticing. After the test footage went viral, more reporters came. Some came with genuine curiosity. Others came with suspicion. One man, dressed in a sharp grey suit and speaking with a perfect accent, asked, "Who gave you this technology?" Armand simply smiled. "Nobody gave it. They threw it away. We picked it up." That answer made headlines around the world. "Ship of scrap lifts off built by forgotten youth." Read one. "Rust to sky, the miracle in the dust town." Read another. "But attention is a dangerous thing." 3 days after the flight, a military drone was seen circling the scrapyard at high altitude. It didn't attack. It just watched. The next night, their internet was cut off for hours. The solar battery systems, which had never failed before, glitched and rebooted without explanation. Rehan found traces of outside access. Someone had tried to hack their system. It failed, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want them to succeed. Still, they worked. Hero redesigned the wing hydraulics. This time, instead of using satellite dish joints, she created a custom bracket system using melted mining claws. Rehan upgraded the AI core by building a parallel brain to small CPUs running the same data, cross-checking each other. That way, if one failed mid-flight, the other could take over in milliseconds. Zubair installed a new shock absorber system. Under the landing gear, old train suspension coils combined with drone stabilizers. It made the base heavier but safer. Everything had to be tougher now. If they were going to fly again, it would be a real test, not a hover, not a brief lift, but an actual flight over the town. The new launch was set for dawn. They didn't invite the press. They didn't inform the town. This time, it was just for them. To see if all the work, the pain, the burns, the bruises, all of it had built something that could really defy the sky. Arman climbed into the pilot seat again. This time, Hira joined him as co-pilot. Rehan and Zubair monitored from the ground, voices calm through the radio. "Power stable, AI core synced, nav system online," Rehan said. "Wings locked, thrusters clear." "All green," Zubair added. Arman's hands hovered over the controls. He glanced at Hira, who gave a tiny nod. He pushed the ignition. The engine roared. Dust swirled. The ship trembled, then lifted. 2 meters, 5, 10. The wings adjusted automatically. Sensors blinking. The ship didn't crash. It flew. Arman guided the ship forward, slowly at first. The ship responded like a bird testing its wings for the first time. They flew over the scrapyard, over the edge of town. People started pouring out of their homes. They pointed, they cheered. Some wept. The ship glided in a circle, then climbed higher. From above, the town looked small, broken, but beautiful. Arman let go of the stick briefly. The ship floated steady. Hira whispered, "It's alive." And it was. They returned safely after 20 minutes. The landing wasn't perfect. Gear slammed harder than the others, but they landed, and the ship didn't break. That night, the team sat around a fire, quiet, tired, but glowing with pride. They had done it. What once was just a dream born in rust was now a reality in motion. But dreams attract danger. The next morning, a dark vehicle parked outside the scrapyard gates. 2 men in black coats stepped out. Government. Their badges were clean, their eyes cold. "You've attracted a lot of attention," one said. "This project is a national interest now. We'll be taking over." "No," Arman said, his voice calm. "You don't have a choice," the man replied. "Either you work with us, or the scrapyard disappears." That night, the team had a long meeting. They could give Inget safety, funding, maybe even fame. But they knew what would happen. The ship would become a weapon. It would be used to control, to dominate, not to inspire, so they made a decision. They would fly Alamein out of the town into open skies, beyond borders, and show the world what it truly meant. The next few days were madness. They installed a long-range communication system from an old satellite truck. They refueled using liquid hydrogen they processed themselves, illegally, from industrial coolant tanks. They stocked food, medical supplies, tools. Armon trained Hera on advanced flight paths. Rihan uploaded a duplicate of the ship's code onto a hidden server. Zubair rigged decoys to make it seem like the ship was still in the yard, even after it was gone. And then, before dawn, they launched again. No crowd, no cheers, just the hum of belief in the darkness. They flew low at first, avoiding radar, then higher, toward the mountains. Rihan and Zubair stayed behind, watching the signal. When it passed the first military checkpoint without detection, they smiled. The mission had begun. In the following days, the world was in shock. A ship, unregistered, untraceable, built from scrap was flying across territories, avoiding detection, appearing in skies where no permission was given. But it never attacked. It never dropped weapons. Instead, it sent messages to forgotten villagers in war zones. You are not alone. 2 schools built from tents. Knowledge can rise from rubble. 2 nations that ignored the poor. We were broken, now we fly. And the people listened. In some cities, students began replicating small versions of Alamein using school project parts. Engineers from broken regions contacted the team, asking for blueprints, advice, hope. The world's leaders began to panic. Who are they? What is this ship? Who controls it? No one did. It was born from rust, raised by pain, fueled by purpose. They had given these young people nothing but scrap, and from that, they had built a ship that could fly past walls, past politics, past fear. They had built a legend, and now, that legend was airborne. The ship Alamein was no longer just a machine made from metal and wire. It had become a symbol, a shadow in the skies, a voice for the voiceless. Wherever it flew, it left behind something far more powerful than fear or silence it left behind. Hope. And for the first time in years, people who had forgotten how to dream were now looking up. But the world's powerful empires did. Not like that, when news spread that a group of young engineers from a forgotten town had built a flying ship. Using nothing but scrap, people were amazed. When that same ship began flying over war zones, dropping messages instead of bombs, the empires started to worry. They had spent billions building fleets and satellites. Yet here was a homemade ship flying over their restricted zones and escaping. Radar without being touched. They called it a ghost ship. They tried to jam its signal, but the team had built backup communication systems in 3 different frequencies. They tried to track it, but Alamein flew too low, too fast, or too high. Every time they thought they had found it, it vanished again, and still, the ship did not attack. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It inspired, in countries ruled by force, people started painting Alamein's shape on their walls. In broken schools, children used plastic bottles to build small flying models. In refugee camps, people tuned in to underground radio stations just to hear if the ship had passed by. Armon and his team were no longer just mechanics. They were legends. But legends attract enemies. A powerful international council of nations backed by old empires held a private meeting. They agreed on one thing. Alameen must be brought down, not because it was dangerous, but because it was free. Because it was reminding people that power doesn't always come from governments or armies. Sometimes it comes from belief, from unity, from scrap turned into steel. They didn't attack at first. They sent warnings, official letters, threats, offers of money. One message read, "Surrender the ship. Come work for us. You'll be rich, protected, respected." Amon read it and burned it. They didn't build Alameen for money or fame. They built it because they were tired of being ignored, tired of begging for a future. And now that they had one, they weren't going to hand it over. So the empires changed their strategy. They sent out the Reaper Fleeter group of high-altitude stealth drones and heavy destroyer ships designed to intercept any unidentified flying object. These weren't ordinary war machines. These were hunter-killers, programmed to disable and erase targets within minutes. Alameen was now being hunted, but Arman and his team had been preparing for this. The ship had already been upgraded. After every flight, Hera adjusted the aerodynamic systems, making the ship more agile. Zubair modified the fuel system to allow for emergency afterburners. Rihan updated the AI core, giving the ship the ability to detect threats before they arrived. And Arman trained simulations, flight patterns, escape routes. He knew the sky like a soldier knows the battlefield. One night, while flying over a neutral border zone, Alameen's systems lit up with warnings. 3 Reaper drones had locked on. They didn't say hello. They didn't give a chance to escape. They fired. Armon screamed, "Brace." The ship swerved hard left, one missile barely missing the wing. The sky turned into fire. Alameen dove, engines roaring, sensors blinking mad. Hera rerouted power to the shields. The second missile came. This time, Rihan's AI made the decision before the pilots could. It launched a decoy signal, confusing the drone's radar. The missile turned and exploded mid-air, but the third one came from below. They couldn't outrun it. Zubair had installed a kinetic shock repulsion system, untested. Arman triggered it in the last second. The ship jolted. The explosion rocked the sky. Smoke, static, silence. Then the ship emerged, damaged, yes, but flying. The Reaper drones began to retreat, not because Alameen had destroyed them, but because it had survived. That was enough to make the Empire panic. The footage went public. A scrap-built ship surviving an attack from the most advanced drones in the world. That was the beginning of the end. Now the people didn't just believe in Alameen. They followed it all across the world. Small towns and broken cities started building their own versions. They called them Emming-class ships. Some failed, some flew, but they didn't care. The idea had already spread. One day, during a silent march in a war-torn capital, people lifted banners that read, "We are not broken. We build. We are Alameen." The empires couldn't control the movement anymore, so they did the only thing they knew: escalate. They launched Operation Sky Cager Plan to ground all unregistered aircraft, shoot down any ship that resembled Alameen, and silence anyone who supported the movement. The skies became dangerous again, but Arman and his team had one last move. They decided to fly straight into the heart of the Empire's airspace, not to attack, to talk. The Empires had invited their own leaders to a summit, a grand meeting under the protection of a sky fortress surrounded by destroyers and drone swarms. The team knew it was risky, maybe suicidal, but they went. As Alameen approached, radars screamed. Fighter jets launched. Unidentified vessel, turn back or be destroyed. Armand replied, calmly, "We don't carry weapons, we carry a message." The jets closed in. Then, something no one expected happened. People inside the Empire began refusing orders. Air traffic controllers shut down radars. One of the jet pilots peeled off and flew beside Alameen, gave a thumbs up, and disappeared into the clouds. Because deep down, even inside the Empire, there were people who believed Alameen reached the summit sky fortress. Instead of shooting, the defense systems powered down, and in the middle of the most guarded sky, on Earth, a ship built from scrap floated silently. With the world watching, Armand's voice was broadcast through every open channel. He didn't give a speech full of anger. He didn't threaten. He said this: "You threw us away. You gave us junk. You left us in silence. We built a voice from that silence. We built wings from that junk. We are not your enemies. We are your reflection of what you forgot, of what you feared. And now the sky belongs to everyone." There was no applause, just silence. And then the defense ships began to power down, one by one. They weren't defeated, they surrendered, not to Al-Amin, to the idea of it, to the belief that anyone, even from nothing, could rise. And as Alameen turned away and flew back toward the clouds, the world below began to change. The sky was quiet again, but it wasn't Desemeski anymore. The world had changed. Alameen had flown into the heart of power and returned safely, not with bombs, not with bullets, but with truth, with courage, with unity. The ship had not won a war. It had ended one before it began. And in doing so, it had started something greater, something no empire had expected. The scrapyard where it all began was no longer a place for rust and silence. Now it had become a training ground. Young people from nearby towns, villages, even faraway countries started arriving. Some walked for days. Some brought nothing but broken tools. But all of them brought something that could not be bought or taught belief. Armand stood at the edge of the yard one morning, watching a new group of students learning how to weld. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. People looked at him like a leader, but he had never asked to be one. He just wanted to build something that mattered. And now, that dream was bigger than him. Hero was setting up a design school under a metal shed. Using chalkboards and salvaged electronics, she taught kids how to sketch engine layouts and calculate flight balance. Her calm voice, once hidden in whispers, now guided dozens. She smiled more often now, not because life was easy, but because she had helped make something impossible come true. Zubair ran the scavenger crew. Every morning, they left in groups, collecting parts from abandoned fields, fallen satellites, forgotten bunkers. They returned covered in dust, but proud. They were no longer stealing. They were reclaiming Rehan, whose hands had once bled from overwork, now taught coding to kids sitting in circles around him. His old laptop still worked barely, but he let the others use it. He had memorized every line of code anyway, and sometimes, when the stars came out, he showed them simulations of how Alameen moved through the sky, letting the children dream in digital colors. But not everything was peaceful. The empires had backed down, but they hadn't vanished. They watched, quietly, they waited, and sometimes they still tried to sabotage. One night, a drone flew low over the scrapyard. It dropped no bombs, it just took pictures. But the message was clear. We're still watching you. The team didn't panic. They upgraded their systems. The scrapyard now had its own defense, grid non-lethal but powerful. Re-coded AI guardians into the towers. Hera installed shield panels over sensitive areas. Arman met with other builders across the region and created a silent alliance network of resistance, made not of warriors, but of inventors. More Amin-class ships were being built now. In Kenya, a team of farmers built one from water pump rotors and tractor parts. It flew in Brazil. Students from a broken city school built one using old traffic light panels and electric bus batteries. It flew in Palestine. A boy who had lost his family in an airstrike built a tiny drone in the shape of Olamin and flew it across the separation wall, carrying a flower. It didn't return, but the image went viral, and it broke something in people's hearts. The idea was alive now, and it could not be killed. 1 year after Olamin's first true flight, the team gathered again not to launch, but to speak. The world had invited them to a global summit, not controlled by empires this time, but by communities, builders, scientists, survivors, all inspired by what they had done. Arman stepped onto a simple wooden stage. The crowd in front of him was huge. Some wore uniforms. Others wore scrap-covered clothes. Some were children. Some were leaders. All of them were listening. He didn't read a speech. He just spoke. We were never meant to win. We were meant to break. But when the world threw us its trash, we built a heart from it. We made engines out of pain, wings out of memory, and we flew. Not to escape, but to return stronger. Today, I ask you, keep building, even when your hands bleed, even when no one believes, because the sky doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who dare. The crowd stood in silence, many with tears, then applause, then chants. Olamin, we build, we fly. That night, the stars looked closer than ever, but something else happened, something unexpected. The empires sent a message. It wasn't a threat, it was a request. They wanted to learn, to share, to understand how this had happened. Not all empires are evil, some are just afraid. And now, many of them were waking up to a new world. The team held a long meeting. They argued, they doubted, but in the end, they agreed. They would open source the ship's blueprints, not for governments, not for corporations, but for people, anywhere, anywhere, free, within weeks. Over 1,000 new builders started their own versions. The sky began to fill with them, different shapes, different colors, but all born from the same story. Olamin was retired from flight. It was placed at the center of the scrapyard, now rebuilt as a learning center. Kids climbed into it every day, not to fly, but to learn, to remember, to imagine. One evening, Arman stood beside the ship, hand on its side. A little girl asked him, "Will it fly again?" He smiled gently. "It already is. Every time someone dreams, it flies again." And that was true, because Olamin was never just a ship. It was a question. What can you build when the world gives you nothing? It was a challenge. Will you give up or rise? And it was an answer. Even in silence, we can build voices. Even in dust, we can rise like wind. Even in brokenness, we can create something that makes empires kneel not with hate, but with hope. That is what they gave the world. And that is how legends live, not in stories, but in action, in belief, in flight, forever.